Okay, in this video I want to talk about the crowding out effect, but before I do that I want to quickly recap fiscal policy. And again, fiscal policy is just going to be the level of government spending and the level of taxes that is going to be enacted by Congress, President, by policymakers. We can have expansionary fiscal policy and we can have contractionary. And expansionary fiscal policy is going to have a decrease in taxes, or it's going to have an increase in government spending. And again, or it could also have both. And again, this will lead to a deficit. So that's always going to lead to either a growing deficit or a budget deficit at the end of the year. Contractionary fiscal policy we're going to use when we have a potential problem of inflation, or if the economy, I should say, is overheating. That's going to involve higher taxes and then a lower level of government spending, and this will lead to a budget surplus. Now, the crowding out effect is going to occur when we have expansionary fiscal policy. And what this is going to be is just the offset in aggregate demand that results when expansionary fiscal policy raises the interest rate and therefore reduces private spending. So what I mean by this is we're going to have government spending, or an increase in government spending, which I've taught you so far would lead to an increase in aggregate demand. And if there's a $100 billion increase in government spending, because of the Keynesian spending multiplier, it might end up being $500 billion in government spending. There's going to be a greater change in aggregate demand and in real GDP than the initial change in government spending. That's true, but it's not completely true, and the reason why is a crowding out effect. And so what can happen is the government will spend more money. So I'm going to write these steps down. So the government spending is going to increase. And then what happens is they need to borrow in order to do this. So this is going to lead to a budget deficit. And then the government's going to need to borrow. So the government will borrow. And the way that they borrow is by selling bonds. So when the government is selling bonds, what happens to the supply of loanable funds is that it's going to change. So when the government is selling bonds, that is money that was in the loanable funds market that is no longer going to be in the loanable funds market. So what ends up happening is the interest rates go up. And so when interest rates go up, the amount of investment is going to fall. And so now you've got this scenario where if I just go back and outline aggregate demand, that's going to equal consumption plus investment spending plus government spending plus net exports. If I have my government spending increasing, but at the same time my levels of investment decreasing, this might have an ambiguous effect on aggregate demand, or at the very least, aggregate demand is not going to increase by as much. So that's the issue here. People are crowded out of the loanable funds market. They're pushed out, interest rates are too high, and the level of investment spending is going to fall. How that happens, and I should add just one more thing, this can occur with contractionary monetary policy. However, with contractionary monetary policy, that's the point. They want to reduce the money supply, and they want to reduce the supply of loanable funds in order to reduce investment. So the crowding out effect is more an issue with expansionary fiscal policy, because with monetary policy, this is the goal. This is what they're trying to do. Whereas the crowding out effect is more like a side effect of expansionary fiscal policy. This is, and I just outlined this a second ago, but this is the main theory as to how this can happen. The government's going to borrow money, and that's really important because they're spending more than they're bringing in tax revenue. So the government's going to borrow money to finance this or to pay for this new increased government spending. So their demand for loanable funds is going to increase, and that part's going to be super important. That's how I want to graph this when we get to that in a second. The government's demand for loanable funds will increase, which means our national demand for loanable funds will increase. That's going to force real interest rates to rise, and then with higher interest rates, investors are going to be less willing to invest. There is another way that this can happen. It's a more roundabout way, but I do think it's worth discussing. Expansionary fiscal policy, again, decreased taxes or more government spending, that's going to lead to people either through the spending multiplier or directly through their lower taxes. That's going to lead to people having increased disposable personal income, which basically means that their wealth is increasing or their income is increasing. So his personal income is going to be increasing. And when our wealth is increasing, we want to buy more things, we want to spend our money. What that means is that we need M1. So there's going to be a greater demand for M1 to purchase these goods and services that we can now afford. So what people will do is they'll withdraw from the bank. And so when people are taking the money from their savings accounts and they're putting it into their pockets, the supply of loanable funds is going to then fall because of people withdrawing their money. Withdraws. Then we have interest rates rising again now because the supply of loanable funds has decreased. Real interest rate goes up. Investors are discouraged. They can't afford. They're crowded out. They're pushed out of the loanable funds market. That's how this can happen. And I also want to just quickly show this graphically and how this can work on a graph. And so I've set up a basic loanable funds market, and I'll give you a second to do this as well. Supply of loanable funds is going to be upward sloping to the right. Demand downward sloping. I have real interest rate over here on my y-axis and the quantity of loanable funds on the x-axis. The first way and the main way that I want you to show this is going to be with the demand for loanable funds increasing. And I just want to graph this quickly just to show you how this can work. I'll call this DLF1. So this is going to be a shift to the right for the demand curve. Now what this is going to lead to is an increased quantity of loanable funds. That means that there's more money available for investment, and the government is taking most of that new money. So there's more money being invested. A lot of this is going to be from the government and at a higher interest rate. And so the part that's misleading here is that, oh, you see the quantity of loanable funds has increased. It has, but this is mainly because of the government's increase in spending. This is not private investment. So in this case, government spending is going up, but private investment might actually be falling. So just be really careful here. Government spending might be increasing, but private spending on new capital and the new technology might be decreasing. This is the main way that I'd like you to show this. There is another way with the supply of loanable funds falling, and this is going to be a less popular way, but still going to be correct. And I would rather you do the demand for loanable funds increasing. I think it's easier to explain it that way. Let me get rid of some of this. So with the supply of loanable funds decreasing, you end up with the same effect on interest rates. The real interest rate is going to rise, except now the quantity of loanable funds has fallen from Q to Q1. And so what happens here is the government is spending more, and so the amount available for private investment has fallen. And I think that that's going to be important. The amount available for private investment is now falling. So that's how I can make this work in terms of the quantity falling. What is left for us has fallen. What is left for private investment has decreased. And I just want to quickly show one more thing. This is the model that I don't often show in this class, but I do think it's helpful this year. This is going to be our investment demand curve, and you've seen this a few times in some questions. And when we've come across this in the past, I've said just treat the investment demand curve as the demand for loanable funds. And I think that you can still do that. But this just quickly shows you when real interest rates are high, the quantity of investment is going to be low. So if I had a real interest rate of 9%, that's fairly expensive, at least in terms of interest rates that we have today. So when real interest rates are high, our quantity of investment is going to be fairly low at $10 billion. If it were at point A and real interest rates fall to 6%, then there's going to be more investing and there's going to be more investment on new technology, new capital, new land, new skyscrapers, new factories, whatever it ends up being. If it falls to 6%, let's say we have an increase to $25 billion of investment, and you can see the pattern continues. If we fall, real interest rate falls to 4%, then we have an increase even more to $35 billion of investment. So the demand for investment, or what this is ID is investment demand. This is going to be downward sloping because as the interest rate falls, there's going to be more profit available and the return on the investment might be greater, so there's going to be more investment. When the real interest rate rises, which is what happens in the crowding out effect, there's going to be less investment spending. So crowding out effect might take you from point A up to point B because interest rates have increased, so the quantity of investment will be falling.